Hello, everybody. It's me in Tiny House Life. Forgive the not so great lighting, but I wanted to at least just do a follow-up video on some of the questions that came up last week and some of the things to expect for our training this week. As we dive further into PBL, let's do this. So, it's me, Sylvie. Hopefully, you know me by now. This is just some of my previous teaching in that environmental school. You've heard me talk about called Learning Gate. I have been teaching for 15 years, mainly in middle school, whoop whoop, but I've taught everything from second grade to ninth grade. And I did teach in an environmental school and some startup charter schools where we did not use textbooks. We had to create all of our own curriculum. We also often taught neurodivergent learners. And so all of our classrooms were mixed, sort of gen ed and exceptional ed, whether that was on learning disabled or exceptionally abled, aka gifted, all in the same classroom, all with the same lesson. So differentiating instruction is something that I'm really passionate about with the same content. Um, and why do I think project-based learning is a great move for Woodson Branch? Is because it's really empowering for you to go from a teacher who holds the knowledge to the facilitator that kids can always get their own knowledge. And it's just fun to have thematic units with a lot of experiential learning. Is what you guys do anyway. So that's why I got the job. Here's just some real examples of me doing PBL with my real students in classrooms. These are, you know, permission granted pictures, consensual pictures. But this one was an example of the ecology of our local watershed, the Hillsborough River. This was a 4-week unit for my seventh graders. And then you can see there the theme objectives. So by the end of the entire unit, what some of those objectives were. And then at the bottom, just sort of my main over the entire month things that I needed as a teacher to make sure were in place before we could get started on the unit. So I won't read all of the objectives, but just to kind of help you figure out how you put standards into whole theme chunks, really identifying what the outcomes are of that lesson at the beginning is going to help you. So I want to make sure that whatever is produced from the student will have at least a 10-minute oral presentation using a PowerPoint. In this case, I specifically was using technology, but you can have a variety. Like it could be a visual presentation of any kind, electronic or three-dimensional. You can switch that up. But that they have to have an information sheet describing at least 5 details of the aforementioned life and the surrounding ecosystem and how they're interrelated, and that there will be a presentation with at least 2 of those following elements in it. And then as far as student objectives, they'll be able to apply traditional and authentic assessments in order to self and peer grade, that they will have writing processes and in conjunction with technology, adding informational text, that they'll locate ecological life and systems by circling their habitats on the map and surrounding regions, and that they will be able to at least label 7 components of the ecological life and systems. So those were some basic. I think for me, because of the way my brain works, it's better for me to, in a K-8 system like yours, break it down into the traditional K2, 3, 5, 6, 8 framework of how those learners have access to project-based learning at the start when you're doing something new. And so one thing that I came up with at my old school that really helps is the younger ones do awareness. So I'm just really taking projects that are things that are within my immediate surroundings that I can smell, touch, see, taste, hear, that I can go out and interact with, like the forest. 3 through 5 is appreciation, so being able to pick projects that, yes, are based out of your area, but appreciating that your area belongs to a bigger region. So appreciating like, okay, if Woodson Branch goes into the Laurel, then where does the Laurel go to? And can I really appreciate that Woodson Branch is not just part of Hot Springs, but it's also part of Madison County, which is also part of Western North Carolina in this watershed. And then my 9 through 12, excuse me, 5th through 8 is action. So now that I know about watershed and I know about point source and non-point source pollution because of the hurricane, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to solve that problem? So it's a way to take project-based learning but make it sort of age appropriate or something that's digestible for your age learner. Hope that's clarifying and not confusing, but we can ask questions tomorrow. So here's an example, some of that activism stuff. I heard some chatter last week of like, how do we do that? Um, and so one example of what we did, this is like way back in 2005, but they were really concerned. We had done an entire year project about where our stuff comes from. So the first day of school, everybody unpacked their backpack and we literally looked at where it was made. And then through humanities and social studies, we literally put all those points on the map. And then we looked at trends and then we did percentages and we found out a large majority of our stuff was made overseas in Asia. And then we figured out that that cost of what we paid for it versus the cost of the raw materials and where it got manufactured and how much it cost the environment to get shipped over was out of balance. And so we had some math in there, some social studies, and some science. But then what we did is a year-long study on figuring out our own individual footprint, human carbon footprint, and how to reduce that. So this was kind of a student-led culminating project where they decided for holiday season, instead of just buying stuff and consuming stuff, they really wanted to educate their families on conscious consumerism and making sure that the products that were available, which were very like normal holiday things, some clothing, some jewelry, some little tchotchkes and knickknacks, some food. Everything was sustainable and conscious. So that was their culminating project. Here's an example of that market. You can see that at the top left, there's peers evaluating other peers. They're going around to each other's tables at the practice market before the real one and kind of running through their booths, asking questions, making sure they're able to answer. And then each student is responsible for grading a peer and also receiving all the feedback from their peers and applying it to their project before the real market, making those adjustments. And so you see the real market there in the middle, the families coming by and doing some shopping. Each student was in charge of setting up their own booth, getting cash for their exchanges, calculating everything in their sales. So you can see how it's interdisciplinary. And then some product that the students chose. Some like these really cool t-shirt designs. Some did sustainable coffee. Others did like gifts with purposes. So it was really cool and engaging, and of course, for me, very rewarding to see what they're all about and what they are passionate about. So I heard another request about, like, okay, but what do the lessons look like? Like, how do we do this? How do I have the same lesson, but somehow it's different for each person's project? And so here's an example of something that we did that's a pretty entry level project based learning idea. So this was in social studies, and we were doing a South America project. So it says at the top, this is kind of what I assigned to the kids. Choose any South American country you're interested in. So there's your voice and choice. I, as the educator, knew that we needed to cover South America for at least 9 weeks because I know my standards and I know that that's what we needed to focus on in that quarter. But which one they wanted to study first and why and what in there, that's up to them. Decide 3 to 6 topics about what drew your interest. So I might have someone who only wants to study the food and the dancing and the clothes and the culture. I might have someone who's like really into the nature and the ethnobiology of a region, like the peoples that live there and the history, right? You might have someone else who's interested in the tourism and the sites and the industry. So, and then decide how you want to plan to present your project. Some people like to talk, some people do not like to talk. Some people like to talk in a blinky box like this. I do not, because I don't know if you're following along or if I'm talking too much or not. So each person has voice and choice or group. And then find your sources. Here's where there's both collaboration as an educator and voice and choice as a student. You have to have at least one book and one reliable primary source and a credible website. So I, across this lesson, have to teach what those things are. And you can pick which one those are. They have to go in those categories. And then you're going to write a plan with your timetable, your materials, your resources, and your clear answerable questions. Before we ever get approved, before you can ever start, there needs to be a clear map that tells me as an educator, you know where you're going, you know how you're going to get there, you're advocating for your learning style, and you're staying accountable and on track. And then there's time in my schedule. I'm going to meet with each one of my students or student groups, and I'm going to sign off um, after we've conferenced. It's usually like 5 to 10 minutes. Some students nail it right away. Some students need to come back 2, 3 times over that first week of planning because maybe it's not as rigorous as you're hoping for, or they forgot an element, they got distracted, or they didn't really understand the assignment, so you might have to mini conference with them. But you don't sign off until you feel like, yep, they've got it, they can hold it on their own, and then the project due date. And then here at the bottom, it's just telling you when you're planning, before we even get started, you need to have a clear vision. You need to have an organized timetable. You need to have accountability. If you know that you're not good or you're a procrastinator or you're not necessarily as regimented at time, who's your buddy that's going to help you? How are you going to learn that skill? You got to know where you're studying to get your knowledge so you're not aimlessly wandering with your time. And you need to know when to communicate with the teacher versus when is the teacher coming to you. So you also have this piece of advocacy, which we'll get into later. And then there's the actual thing I want you to make. So there's no ambiguity with the parents, no one being like, what is it that you want from me? I want something that has a clear format. You need to be speaking and writing. It needs to be structured and organized, demonstrating knowledge, creativity, and personal challenge. So there's parameters and interpretation. So here's just an example of English language arts, ELA standards, because there's so much in reading and writing. That's the backbone of a K-8 curriculum. And so we're reading and we're writing, but we're doing it in ways that give some voice and choice to students to allow for a higher level of engagement and rigor. So on the left, I don't love this term, but we'll say that this was my middle school group that was more advanced. They were reading at a higher grade level and writing at a higher grade level than they were actually in chronologically. And so they chose to read Life of Pi. Um, all our books were environmentally themed, and we were in an ocean biome, and they really wanted to challenge themselves with adult reading. But because it was such a challenging and thick book, they decided that they wanted to immerse themselves in the story, and the way that they learned best is as they read aloud. They actually built the set. And so, for those of you who don't know, it's about a boy named Pi who gets aboard a ship with animals from India. He's moving a zoo from India to America with his father, and the boat sinks, and it's just him with a couple of zoo animals on a boat. One of them is a tiger. And so the kids really wanted to build the boat according to the dimensions and have someone play the tiger and have someone play Pi. have someone play one of the other animals as they read aloud, and that really helped them comprehend. So that was a project that lasted a whole semester. And the top was my class that maybe needed some assistance with reading comprehension. And we found that having technology where they could hear it, see it, and read it at the same time was really helpful for them. And having them comprehend by building PowerPoints and using pictures as they were listening was a great approach. Over to the right, nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody because a lot of us do like writing, but it's not conventional that students love to write. But if you want them to write often, which you should, have them just write in different ways. Have a writer's circle, which is literally what we did. Just get their bodies more comfortable and have the experience be more pleasurable. And then the bottom one here is a whole semester, so half a year trial for my graduates. We are an environmental charter school, so we were studying the effects of forest fire, and we had a case of uh, unprescribed burn gone wrong, and they were trying to figure out who in the park set the fire. And so they had to figure out like who was going to be the lawyer, who were going to be the jury, who were going to be the defenders, who were going to be the campers, what they each had to say. And there was no me giving them the answer. They had to figure out through this trial if they could ask the right questions to find the right camper. And so it turned out that they had to know a lot about like which turned out it was like a slash pine, the campfire that was close to the slash pine, because slash pines melt their wax when it's under fire so that they can actually seed. And so they knew which campfire set the was the original fire starter because of how many pine cones were open. Had they not been able to synthesize all of that information in a really high order thought pattern, they would have never gotten to the verdict, the correct verdict in the trial. So those are just some examples of how to incorporate writing and reading in a PBL approach. I did talk a bit about Bloom's taxonomy, so hopefully this is an overkill. I'm just trying to answer all the questions. How do we do it? Same book, different level learners. We use a scaffolded approach with an interest inventory. I'm already going to know my kids who love it, my kids who are not into it. I'm going to tie it into as many subjects as I can so I can get into as many learning pathways as I can under my reading. I'm going to make it a safe environment to ask for help. Sometimes when I read aloud, I purposely stutter, not to be inauthentic, but to show that reading can be hard even for quote unquote people who know how to. Or I might stop and sound out a word, right, and model some of that stuff. Um, and then alternate assessments for my friends who have super high test anxiety. Can we have them act it out, write a play, present it in an alternative way? And making sure we're reading on all the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So you can see the example of that assessment here on the right-hand side. You know, your very basic rote memorization, definitions. These are all sort of lower level thinkings. And then there starts to be some application here when Esperanza's grandmother said, No hay rosa sin espinas, no, there's no rose without a thorn. What did she mean? So now I have to really synthesize everything I've learned to come up with an answer and apply that. And then the last one is sort of the deepest or the highest thought, which is, can I apply this outside of this book into real life? And so it's sort of more of a, what do you think about it? What's your opinion? Writing is the same thing. I always want to tie it into other disciplines with high expectations. So, can I tie my writing of Esperanza Rising into the social construct of what was happening with immigrant farmers at that time and migrant farmers at that time between Mexico and Southern California, where the book was set? How does that make me feel about my own community and the farmers in my own community? Can I have circular reinforcement of concept. So if it's a narrative essay and I don't want to write 6 narrative essays every week for the semester, can I have some narrative poems? Can I have some narrative writing about Esperanza? Can I then talk about interviewing a farmer in my area? Or if I were a farmer, how would I do it the same? Balanced combination of expressive outlet and fundamental skills. So you do have to teach sentence structure and grammar in expository essay, but make them talk about themselves, especially middle schoolers love to talk about themselves. I taught all my ELA about, oh, we're going to read Beowulf and like uh, how to write a six-tuplet poem or whatever it's called, septuplet, and you're gonna make it all about your secret crush, right? And don't tell us any name. And then, of course, I'm going to keep my standards in line with the state standards and scoring system, if not higher. You all have a lot of wraparound programs that are really dope. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight that's also project-based learning. I used to teach a hip hop dance class, beginners, very, very beginners. Uh, to our middle schoolers just as a way to engage them. And we were able to really talk about some things like collaboration, communication, physics, and some of the choreography, interpretive arts that we were able to incorporate into our PBL, like make movements like animals, right? We were just studying this in our ecological system. Let's make a dance about it. Um, always do extracurricular and at-home tie-ins. Trips. These are just some of our out in the community trips. I know that you all are very steeped in field trip culture. Whoop, whoop. Um, and this is just again how you can incorporate PBL when you're out sort of in the bush doing certain things. Um, we did speech and debate where they had to choose their own relevant topics to articulate their thoughts and opinions on. We did some real life explorations in different ecosystems that had conservationist research goals in mind. So we tracked with other researchers. We stayed with the indigenous peoples of Big Cypress, which was at some of the headwaters in the Everglades, and we learned from the indigenous peoples ways to care for our local environment. And so the project-based learning keeps having these extensions of real life application, and the higher and deeper you go in learning, the more these extensions can really have kids directly interfacing with adult world problems and solving them and innovating them, which is my favorite part. Okay, so you learned all your foundational things last week, and you saw how I did it and why I'm here as a expert, which I'm not. I've just done it before, and I'm here to help. So what did you see? Now, I know that you and I can't really talk to each other right now, but I want you to actually answer that. I want you to write it down. I want you to see if your brain knows the answer already, or if you have to like look back in your notes and think about it. What PBL things were evident to you? I'm just giving you some things. So that lets you know where you are and your sort of like comprehension of this and whether your mind is sort of wrapping around it. It's like, oh yeah, I see the relevance of real world problems or open ended, or I can see the balance between structure and voice and choice, or I still don't know. Either one of those is okay, just kind of like a litmus test. So here's where you're at. These are your classrooms, your projects that you've done. You've already been doing driving questions. In this case, we talked a lot about driving questions being about recovery, ecosystem recovery, and community recovery post-Helene, post-flood. The authentic context for you all is very much Appalachian culture and just little tiny neck of the woods that you live in, and the student-led investigation you have in spades. Collaboration, you already seem to be cross-pollinating, and there's so much more scheduled in for the cross-pollinating. The multiple products, you seem to already have, like, not everybody has to take a test, not everybody has to sort of do this traditional school output. And then the reflection and evaluation is going to be the same, different. You're going to be evaluating as you normally do, but adding in some extra sort of PBL specific reflective pieces, which we'll talk about. So, oh, there's my chicken saying hi. One of them left. So we're in our land. This is our first step, launch and engage. We've learned, we're feeling a little comfy, we're ready to dive in. So we're going to start looking at our actual projects, our driving questions, how we're going to spark our student interest. I heard a huge ask for like a sort of map of where we're going. And so I just wanted to show you that this is sort of a think ahead of how to carry out the whole thing. Do not study this map. Do not obsess over this map. It's one step at a time. But those of you who like to plan, you can kind of see that we're between steps 1 and 3. We understand what PBL is and why we want to use it. We've shared some resources and examples of PBL in action and high quality PBL. And now we're getting together with our why specifically and are starting to map our own standards, how often we want to go over them, which are the imperative ones, which are the ones we need to loop back throughout the year, and then coming with our team for some of those initial ideas. And then if we have a sense of who has buy-in, who still needs support, and then some of our beginning ideas of like how we want to map out our resources and some of our projects. But just to look ahead, when you have a plan, you're like, okay, first 2 weeks we're doing this, and this is what we need. Next 2 weeks we're doing this, and this is our assessment. Then you start to get through 6 through 8. But right now we're like making good progress. For week 1, we're booking along and right where we need to be, and we'll be probably at like step 8, 9, maybe 10 by the end of this week. Okay, so where we're picking up this week is just the researching, designing, and implementing. So we want to get in there, right? Roll up our sleeves and start making some projects. Figuring out as teachers, what do we need to have before the students come into our classroom? Those are some of the things. And just your own individual teacher roadmap. This is steps 1 through 10 again, are where we're at, and you can kind of internally, without anyone else knowing, do your own little checklist. I know the standards that I want to target. Maybe you do. Maybe you want to get them together before our training. Maybe you want to get them together during our training. But that's where your brain should be right now that we understand what we're doing. I know the skills, concepts, and knowledge I need to teach. So if I'm in younger grades, maybe it's still cursive. I don't know how y'all do that. Maybe it's fractions in middle school. Maybe it's informational text in 3rd through 5th grade, intermediate. You kind of have that sense for your grade level. And then I have a project or product idea. I have a concept or driving question. And that's all of stage 1. And then stage 2 is I'm identifying a real world problem. I have a real world audience or resources identified, and I have crafted my essential question for the unit. I'll show you an example about uh, soil remediation, right, which is something that has come up from the toxic mud, and how do we remediate the soil? That's an essential driving question. Step 7, mapping out your unit in phases. So how am I going to even introduce, like, before I can talk about soil remediation, I've got to talk about point source and non-point source pollution. I've got to talk about watersheds. I've got to talk about mushrooms and uh, nitrogen and pH and all kinds of stuff, right, before I can culminate those things. I've planned out my unit assessments. I know if I'm trying to teach this, this is what I'm assessing to make sure that I'm doing what I said I'm going to do. And I planned out my presentation, like what I want the outcome to come out as. It could be a community service project, it could be a turn and talk, it could be a parent chair, and then you are all ready to launch, right? In that final stage, stage 5, you feel like, yes, I have all my materials, I have everything mapped out, I feel like I'm good on my project timeline, I know how I'm going to share out, I know who I'm collaborating with, internally and externally, and I'm excited, stoked, and ready to launch. I hope. So there was a kind of question about, as teachers, how does your sort of facilitator work week look like? And I just pulled up some sort of traditional good starting points depending on your grade level and your teaching style, your teaching teams. You can kind of pick the red one or the green one or make a mishmash, a continuum between the two that works for you and your team. But in one section, you start off a project. This is an example for a 2-week project. You can extend it to like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever you want. A typical flow would be like, okay, you're starting with introducing the concept. There's an I do, we do teaching where you're sort of giving a lecture and then having an activity that's reinforcing that concept. Um, and then the next day you're going to review that and then have, workstations for the kids to apply their knowledge. Wednesday, we're going to have some group work around that. Thursday, we're going to have some sort of assessment of like, did we uptake those skills? And then Friday, we're going to have like a reteach or an extension of that concept and then a follow up activity. Week 2, we're going to have stations again reviewing, making sure we're retaining our knowledge. And we're going to conference with each student, making sure that like everybody gets addressed if they have needing extensions, needing remediation, making our project, presenting our projects, and then celebrating out to the community. On the other hand, you sort of start with a bang, you have a big opening event, a field trip, a guest speaker, something, a science experiment, and then you work backward to the mini lesson with work time and reflection on, okay, if I want to do that same thing, how do I break it down? What skills do I need to learn? And kind of do an inquiry-based learning style with critique protocol and work time. So I'm really like laying out my rubric right from the beginning. Like, what am I trying to learn here? And how can I advocate for my best pathway of learning that? And then Thursday, those explicit hard skills, those lessons and application of those skills. Where are we at? Friday, really again, trying to peer assess and assess ourselves and figure out what we need to really attain those skills for our project. Independent work time. And then week 2 is more of that project where we're discussing our own idea with the teacher, having those mini conferences, working more independently / collaboratively with peers, reflecting and giving each other rubrics and feedbacks, and then finally sharing out to the community. So here's a good assessment of figuring out where you're at. Do you have low skill, like your standards aren't planned out yet, but you're really excited? Do you have everything planned out and you're super stoked? Do you have everything planned out, but like you're not super stoked? Or are you not stoked and you're still not organized, which is totally fine as well. This is internal for you, just in preparation for tomorrow to see where your head's at. All right, there's all your beautiful humans, and the new humans will be added in our next picture. But what cornerstones do you think you and your teaching team will exhibit? What do you feel like your strengths are? What do you feel like you lack right now? What do you think is good about the school at the end of Friday where we're like, yeah, we kind of got this? Where do we feel like we don't got this? So if I look at my PBL skills for my kids and what I'm trying to teach, where do I feel like I have strengths? And where do I feel like I might need to lean on somebody for those skills? So here are just some questions as we go into this week and really like roll up our sleeves. And I'll have some question and answer time, of course, tomorrow and throughout the week. Again, this is just a little checklist of where your brain's at. We understand PBL. We've had PBL training customized to our site and our vision. We feel like we're ready to start implementing some stuff with our teams, where our teams, not teens, teams, and we're reflecting on how we're doing, what we still need to tweak, what we still need to learn. Further than you thought you did, in my opinion. Again, here's a roadmap for those of you who just like really want to check off that. Yep, I know where I'm going. I know where we have. What I need to do individually is I need to know my standards. I need to know which ones I'm doing quarter one, which ones I'm doing all 4 quarters, which ones I do a lot of, which ones I just sprinkle and dabble. And then I need to know the concepts, the overarching concepts and knowledge that I'm really, really trying to have my kids leave with, and how that connects with my grade before and my grade, the grade they're matriculating to. And then your project, product, idea, and driving question. That's our goal over the next 3 weeks, those 3 steps. So let's get ready for training. Let's get introduced to our database and me as a trainer. We'll see how that goes. And let's grow with the flow. Thanks for being here in my little virtual message and bearing with me. And I look forward to our training tomorrow and answering more of your questions.